Welcome to a new edition of Grant's World. In this issue, you're going to hear from Ann, our executive director, who will bring you up to date on the library and the happenings at the Grant Association. We have a segment from a graduate student that chose Mississippi State University, Ulysses S. Grant Archives, to do his research on Babcock. And the keynote speaker is Edna Green Medford, who will talk about Grant and the Black vote. So let's go.
Hello and greetings from the Grant Presidential Library. I'm here with just a few updates for you. We have had a very busy summer here at the library. We have hosted hundreds of visitors that have come to us from around the country and even from abroad. And it's always exciting to see where people are coming from and why they feel moved to come visit us here at the library. We've also had a researcher that has made use of our USGA Research Award. Kyle Vradovich came from the University of Tennessee, where he is a PhD student doing some research on Orville Babcock. And as some of you may know, we do have the Orville Babcock collection here at Mississippi State in the USGA collection. And so Kyle made great use of that collection, and we were so glad to host him, and he was very grateful for the financial assistance that we were able to give him from the USGA. We also have exciting news on the new building front. The wheels have started to turn on that process, albeit a little slowly. We have started meeting with the architects and the programmers for the new library, so expect some updates on that hopefully in the nearest future. And finally today, I wanted to call your attention to Ulysses S. Grant. This particular grant belonged to a businessman in Texas, and when he passed away a little over a year ago, his family very generously decided to donate this portrait along with several other very nice grant items to the library. The family realized that because we are a presidential library and because we have such a great facility here at Mississippi State, that we would be great custodians for their father's collection, and that we'd be a place where people could come from all over the world to enjoy that collection. I also want to point out that this is a very unique portrait because we don't actually have a lot of information about this piece. It's unsigned. And we don't know who painted it and when. Supposedly, this portrait hung over top a bar in Texas for several years, and at some point in time, gained 2 small bullet holes above Grant's nose and eyebrow when an apparently angry Texan, who probably had a little too much to drink at that bar, took aim at our dear president. And we have no way of knowing if this is actually true or not. There's no documentation on it, but we can see the evidence of these bullet holes, and we do think it's a pretty great story. So with this in mind, we'd like to encourage anyone who may have Grant artifacts or know people who also have Grant artifacts to think about donating them to our library because they really do have a safe home here where people can see them and enjoy them. And so on that note, I will see you next time.
On July 4th, 1863, after 47 grueling days of siege warfare, General Ulysses S. Grant and his troops entered the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi.
The garrison of Vicksburg surrendered this morning. Number of prisoners as given by the officers is 27,000. Field artillery, 128 pieces, and a large number of siege guns, probably not less than 80. The other stores will probably not amount to any great deal. Major General Ulysses S. Grant to Nathaniel Banks, July 4th, 1863.
As the Union troops swept through Vicksburg, they found the abandoned printing office of the city's only active newspaper, the Daily Citizen. Out of desperation, the newspaper's editor, James M. Swords, had been printing issues on the backside of pieces of wallpaper. Grant described the newspaper in his personal memoirs.
The Vicksburg paper, which we received regularly through the courtesy of the rebel pickets, said prior to the 4th, in speaking of the Yankee, boast that they would take dinner in Vicksburg that day, that the best recipe for cooking a rabbit was first catch your rabbit.
The Union troops were surprised to find that Swords left the typeset for the July 2nd issue. They printed the issue with a few edits at the end. It read,
"This is the last wallpaper edition, and is, excepting this note, from the types as we found them. It will be valuable hereafter as a curiosity."
Nearly 160 years after the event, the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, located in Starkville, Mississippi, had the opportunity to acquire an original copy of the July 2nd issue of the Daily Citizen.
Once we had the Daily Citizen in our possession, the next step was to actually authenticate it. Because this issue of the Daily Citizen was such an iconic piece of Civil War memorabilia, it's been duplicated numerous times, and there are lots of duplicates out there. So we wanted to be sure that we had one of the couple of dozen of original copies in existence.
There have been over 30 reprints of the Daily Citizen's July 2nd issue that we really need to go through and look at each version to determine whether it's a reproduction or whether it's one of the original's first or second editions. And so the Library of Congress has created a 10-point system to determine whether it is an original or a reproduction. Now, we have two versions of the Daily Citizen in our collection here. This on the left, donated by the Keenum family. This on the right, donated to us by our friends at the Columbus Lowndes Public Library. Now, automatically, just by looking at the two, I can determine that one is a reproduction and one has questions as to whether it's an original. The one on the right is very cleanly done. The font is very clean. There aren't really any imperfections in the printing, but it's also yellowed. And the one on the left is still very clearly white paper. That's because paper during the Civil War period was generally made of cotton and cotton rag, versus paper in the late 19th and through the 20th century, which is usually made of pine and has a high degree of lignin, which is very acidic, and that's why newspaper yellows very quickly. This is turning yellow. The one on the left still is in pretty good shape. If we go through, though, point by point of the Library of Congress's determining requirements, we look that both of them are about the same size, 9 inches, a little more than 9 inches wide, about 16 inches long. So they both kind of meet that first determination. Column 4, the last article before the note, a single quote around the word dead instead of a double quote. And sure enough, it says double quote, old Grimes is single quote dead, versus the one on the right, which says double quote, old Grimes is dead, period, double quote, close quote. So according to all of the 10 guidelines and requirements by the Library of Congress for a copy of the Daily Citizen to be an original and a second edition in this case, this one on the left meets all of those requirements.
We appreciate our copy of the Vicksburg Daily Citizen because it really gives us and our students a lot of insight into what people during the Civil War era were thinking and feeling, the ways that they tried to cope with hardship and even trauma. And it allows us to properly contextualize this very critical moment in Ulysses S. Grant's presence in Mississippi.
Hi, Kyle. Would you please tell our members about who you are, what university you attend, and your area of expertise?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure. My name's Kyle Ratarich. I am a fifth year PhD candidate at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I study with Dr. Luke Harlow and Dr. Michael Woods, work on Civil War era Reconstruction politics, really looking at the role of kind of the behind the scenes individuals that worked within the Grant administration, and then the scandals that they were up to, and seeing really if corruption was going on or if it was more claims of corruption during the Grant administration.
Thank you. What is your interest in Babcock, and what were the circumstances that brought you to Mississippi State University and the Presidential Grant Archives?
Well, my interest in Babcock kind of began when reading the numerous Grant biographies that I've been through in my life. I stumbled upon him kind of in footnotes and never really heard his story in full. He would pop up in different seemingly important events and then all of a sudden disappear again. So it was something that, as I've been a Grant buff my whole life, so as I've been investigating Grant and his presidency, I wanted to know more about this person's story and why it hasn't been told yet. So when I was working on my master's degree, I went to the Newberry Library to look at the Babcock papers, and then found out while I was there that Mississippi State houses not only the Grant papers, but some of Babcock's diaries. Some of them are from the war. He's written some stuff from his journey to Santo Domingo. He kind of suspiciously stops when he starts being allegedly involved in some of these nefarious deals that he's claimed to be in, but it's still very important stuff. So I started to look into Mississippi State and was very honored that I was able to reach out to Dr. Ryan Semmes and Dr. Ann Marshall, who helped me through a process of obtaining the Grant Scholar program. I believe it's a fellowship that I was able to come down and spend 2 weeks this past summer working through the many boxes and many folders that were Grant during Reconstruction, and really gave me an insight into the archival side of things, as I just saw how many boxes I didn't even get to see. So it was an excellent time, and I can't thank them and the entire U.S. Grant Association for the funding that they were able to afford me.
Kyle, what was the relationship between Grant and Babcock?
So Grant and Babcock's friendship is one that is definitely complicated. Grant is somebody who has the utmost faith in his friends and those he cares about. In this case, he served with Babcock, or Babcock served under him rather, during the Civil War, and then continued to serve under him during Grant's presidency. Therefore, Grant trusts this man. He allows him to speak for him and to accomplish goals on behalf of him and the nation. So Babcock recognizes this, and once he begins to see that there's an avenue because of the expanded federal powers during the Civil War, he sees an opportunity for grift, for personal gain, and he takes advantage in some instances. This is highlighted by the whiskey ring, in which Babcock is really the big known perpetrator. And even at this point, Grant testifies on his behalf in a criminal trial as the sitting president, which is unheard of at the moment. So Babcock recognizes that Grant is not only his dear friend, but also his shield from a lot of trouble. And Grant does what he can to protect his friend. Eventually, he realizes that enough is enough, and there is an issue where he has to replace Babcock and still allows him to have a federal job, but it becomes a point of misplaced trust and still almost longing for friends that what we believed them to be rather than what they are.
Thank you, Kyle. That was very interesting. And we're going to keep track of you because I can tell you're going to be going places. Thanks again. Our keynote speaker today is Edna Green Medford, a PhD. She is a professor of history emerita at former associate provost for faculty affairs at Howard University in Washington, D.C. During the 35 years she was at Howard, she also served as chairperson of the Department of History and intern dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She retired from the university in December 2021. Dr. Medford's research has focused on American slavery, the Civil War, emancipation, and Reconstruction. Over the last 35 years, she has shared her scholarship through publications, as well as providing commentary for historical documentaries, participated in media interviews, and presented invited talks here and abroad. She is author of Lincoln and Emancipation, now in its second printing, co-author of the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 Views, and editor of the History Report of New York's African Burial Ground Project. She has also authored numerous refereed articles and book chapters that have appeared in both national and international publications. She is currently co-authoring a book-length study of a Midwestern Black family's remarkable journey in the generation pursuit of freedom and equality in America. Dr. Medford is the recipient of several honors, and among those is our own John Y. Simon Award. Edna?
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. I want to talk a little bit this afternoon about Grant and the Black vote. There's a lot of literature at the moment on the role that Grant played in promoting civil rights for African Americans during the Reconstruction period. And so I want to look a little bit more closely at what African Americans thought of him and why they supported him in the 2 elections, in 1868 and in 1872. So I'll start. A few days after Ulysses S. Grant lost his final battle, Frederick Douglass, the representative man of African Americans in the 19th century, eulogized him as the most illustrious warrior and statesman of modern times, a man too broad for prejudice, too humane to despise the humblest, too great to be small. In Douglass's estimation, Grant was a protector of Black people and the person most responsible for their enfranchisement. In protecting the free people from violence, quote, his moral courage surpassed that of his party. Other African Americans shared Douglass's glowing assessment of Grant. Black soldiers honored him by marching in his funeral cortege, while everyday men and women watched the procession from the sidelines. Leaders of the African American community sent letters of tribute to newspapers and established a fundraising campaign to create scholarships in Grant's name for students attending a Black college. In his letter to the Christian Recorder newspaper, the organ of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, William Hannibal Thomas, a former journalist, jurist, and South Carolina legislator during Reconstruction, wrote that, quote, Grant's life and character furnished the best incentive of the youth of the Union. Acknowledging the scathing criticism the former president received over the years because of the behavior of members of his administration, Thomas assured the Recorder's readers that the prejudice and hitherto reckless talk against Grant would be dissipated by the sunlight of truth in the more rational hours of national reflection. I love the way they wrote, the way they expressed themselves during this period. It would take more than a century for Douglas's prediction, for Thomas's prediction to be realized. Historians would interpret the Grant presidential years as a time of unprecedented corruption in government. Although he had not taken part in the misdeeds of certain members of his administration, his leadership would be called into question. In recent years, however, his reputation has witnessed an upturn, due in large measure to the stellar scholarship of a few historians who have focused on the many accomplishments of the Reconstruction era. That turnaround is captured in presidential surveys conducted by C-SPAN since 2000. The cable network surveys, 4 of them thus far, have ranked the chief executives in 10 separate categories that considered leadership skills in various areas, including crisis and economic management, international relations, the relationship with Congress, moral authority, and vision. In the first poll in 2000, Grant ranked 33rd overall. Just 2 decades later, in 2021, the most recent date of the surveys, he had climbed to 20th place. The surveys also show that our view of Grant's role in securing civil rights to all Americans has also changed over time. While in 2000, the president who oversaw Reconstruction received a ranking of 18 for the category Pursued Equal Justice for All, which is not a bad place from which to start, as it put him in the top half of presidents in that category. By 2021, he had risen to 6th place, just ahead of John F. Kennedy, and sharing the top spots with Lincoln, Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, that is, Obama, Truman, and Carter, who finished in that order. Some of our most respected scholars have concluded that given his role in securing Black voting rights and suppressing the violence of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction, Grant deserves much of the credit for these protections. Nevertheless, Grant has not escaped the attacks on memorials that have occupied the attention of the nation in recent years. Mostly focused on the removal of Confederate heroes, the movement expanded to include those leaders who had engaged in actions or held views that offended our 21st century sensibilities. Protesters called for the removal of representations of heroes who had been enslavers or who, by today's definition, would be considered racist. For instance, the Emancipation Memorial, located in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C., was threatened with removal by groups that thought the depiction of the half-kneeling freedman rising at Lincoln's beckoning was indicative of servility, not freedom. Grant came under attack as well because of his ownership of a Black man he had acquired from his father-in-law, a slaveholder and supporter of the Confederacy. If we are able to avoid presentism, which is something very hard to do and something I've been accused of on numerous occasions. And if we can confine ourselves to norms of his era, we might conclude that Grant was, like Lincoln, a man of his times who gradually came to embrace the idea of full and immediate citizenship for African Americans. He shared the prevailing belief among many, if not most, white Americans that Black men and women were innately inferior, and he struggled with how quickly to admit them to the body politic. Depending on one's perspective, Grant was either an unlikely candidate to play the role of ally to African Americans in the post-war era, or ideally suited for the position. Born in 1822, he and other white Americans benefited from the extension of democracy to the common man that the era witnessed. Expanding voting rights gave those Americans a political stake in the society and bound them more closely to American ideals. Unfortunately, African Americans could not share in the boundless optimism of their fellow Americans. Most people of color were enslaved. As human property, they had no rights. States that had allowed free Black men to vote in the early years of the nation's founding now thought it best to rescind those privileges. and the states emerging from the Northwest Territory followed suit. Black men and women in the North were legally free, but they enjoyed few of the rights to which white men and women were entitled because of birth. As slavery died in the North, primarily through gradualism, it gained strength in the slaveholding South, as the end of the transatlantic trade in human cargo spawned a domestic trade. The average mid-19th century American accepted the position of Black people, this position of Black people, as simply a fact of life, and at best were indifferent to the issue of discrimination as well as slavery. All white Americans benefited from the degraded social and legal position of African Americans and enjoyed the products of the enslaved man and woman's labor. Even in the North, abolitionists were viewed as troublemakers, people whose defense of freedom might lead to the nation being torn apart. We know little about Grant's views on slavery and the rights of Black people before he became the instrument of Lincoln's wartime policies. And what we do know is contradictory. Although he grew up in an abolitionist household, Grant appears not to have shared his parents' interest in and support of Black freedom before the war. I never was an abolitionist, he wrote to friend and Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburn in August of 1863. Not even what could be called anti-slavery. But he added that I tried to judge fairly and honestly, and it became patent in my mind early in the rebellion that the North and South could never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery. As anxious as I am to see peace established, I would not therefore be willing to see any settlement until the question is forever settled. When he accepted his father-in-law's invitation to live and manage the 850-acre Whitehaven estate, he knew he would be supervising the enslaved laborers that Frederick Dent owned and employed in agriculture as well as in domestic work. He also benefited from the labor of 4 other enslaved people who were in his wife's possession and who just before the war were hired out. Scholars have argued that he did not support the anti-slavery Republican Party before the war because he feared the party's anti-slavery agitation would lead to disunion. And so I think we can conclude that his views about slavery were tied very closely to how he felt about keeping the Union united. So like Lincoln, he was willing to do almost anything that was necessary to keep the Union together. And of course, he changes over time, or he thinks at least over time that the end of slavery is what will keep the Union together or reunited. Complicating the narrative of Grant's position on slavery is his manumission of William Jones. Grant held Jones for a few years, and in 1859, for reasons unknown, and while very much in need of cash, he chose to free Jones rather than sell him. We may never know his motivation for doing this, but his actions as slaveholder and manumitter have left scholars perplexed. Grant's ambiguous views on slavery and his experience with slaveholding did not deter contemporary African Americans from supporting him in 2 of the most important campaigns of his life. He was able to garner their support in large part because of his affiliation with the Republican Party, the party that championed Black rights in the 1860s, the party of Lincoln. His predecessor in the White House, Andrew Johnson, had been especially hostile to the freedmen. The Democrat, who had remained loyal to the Union during the war and had been initially hostile to the slaveholders, could not resist the overtures made to him by former Confederates eager to regain power and control of state governments. He opposed the Freedmen's Bureau that was intended to ease the transition from slavery to freedom and dismissed the concerns of a delegation of Black leaders who urged him to help secure civil and political rights for Black men. Grant's response would be quite different. With the impeachment of Johnson and the passage of the 1867 Reconstruction Acts, the so-called radical Republicans solidified their control of the federal government and shaped Reconstruction policy for the next decade. The first Reconstruction Act required the defeated states to convene conventions to form new governments and draft constitutions that conformed with the U.S. Constitution. Those conventions would include Black delegates, and the new constitutions would extend voting rights to all male citizens of at least 21 years old, of whatever race, color, or previous condition. The rebel states were divided into 5 military districts, each with a military governor backed up by federal troops. Upon meeting these and other requirements of Reconstruction, those states would be readmitted to the Union. A year later, in the first national election since the end of the war, the Reconstruction policies of the Republicans became the topic of concern. The question of universal voting rights for African American men was central to this discussion. The 1868 Republican platform championed the equal suffrage of all loyal men in the South, but left it to the individual northern states to decide the suffrage issue for themselves. Grant supported the Republican position on Black male suffrage after apparently initially having some reservations about its merit. In his memoirs, he argues that Congress was forced by Johnson's pardoning of secessionists and the South's reclaiming of political power to, quote, enfranchise the Negro in all his ignorance. The majority of Northerners, he believed, favored a probationary period in which the ex-slaves could prepare themselves for the privileges of citizenship before the full right would be conferred. As to myself, he confessed, while strongly favoring the course that would be the least humiliating to the people who had been in rebellion, I gradually worked up to the point where, with the majority of the people, I favored immediate enfranchisement. Grant and the Republicans knew that enfranchising Black men in the South would redound to the benefit of the party, since the freedmen were likely to vote the party that had been credited with their liberation. Contrarily, insisting on the extension of political rights in the North would alienate white men who were disinclined to share power with men they viewed as inferior. The position of the Democratic Party at that time was decidedly against Black voting rights anywhere in the country. They countered the Republican platform with a call for, quote, the regulation of the elective franchise in the states by their citizens, the abolition of the Freedmen's Bureau, and all political instrumentalities designed to secure Negro supremacy. The Republican candidate, Grant, was referred to as the Negro leader, and they did not use the word Negro. The Democrats adopted a campaign song that expressed its disdain for the Black voter and for Northern whites who came South after the war. Entitled "Raise High the White Man's Banner," it spoke of vindicating the cause of their fathers, challenging mendicant or Negro rule, and preserving a white man's government. No wonder African Americans viewed the 1868 election as the grand finale of the struggle between liberty and slavery. In challenging the Democrats' position and in their attempt to strengthen the resolve of members of the Republican Party, they reminded the nation of the sacrifice made by those Black men who lost limbs and lives for the cause of union. All now were entitled to share in the government. Those Black men who could vote were encouraged to support the candidate who acknowledged their service to the nation, as their former oppressors sought to tear down the government. Other groups were even more direct in their appeal to Black voters. Men of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, meeting at its annual conference in Newport, Rhode Island in July 1868, recognized that there was a movement underway to divide the Republican vote by nominating Salmon P. Chase as the Democratic candidate and to induce Black men to cast their votes for him. The conference resolved that its members would not vote for the nominee of the Democratic Party, but on the contrary, we will use all honorable means to secure the election of the nominees of the Republican Party. It was not initially clear who the Republican candidate would be. Oliver Otis Howard, the Christian general and commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, was a choice of those who saw him as the only one who could strengthen the party. Salmon Chase was a potential candidate, but it was felt that he was not well known among Republican voters in the South and not well liked by those who did know him in the North. And then there was Grant, the war hero, who with Lincoln's leadership had saved the Union and helped to bring America closer to being the land of the free. One observer of the time noted that Grant was, quote, somewhat better than Chase, but not ideal, while he had no especially bitter enemies, he had no enthusiastic friends either. The party leaders would rally behind him if he received the nomination, but he would not be able to garner much excitement among the masses of Republican voters. The rank and file, they said, would give a sleepy acquiescence and a moderate vote would be polled for him. It was clear, however, that whoever became the Republican standard bearer would have to win over the Southern radical vote, especially appeal to the newest members of the party. Quote, it makes no difference who their candidate can be, may be, the observer noted. He cannot be elected without help from Africa. On election day, Africa turned out in significant numbers in the former Confederacy. It was the first federal election since the end of the war, and the first in which the newly emancipated were allowed to vote for national candidates, because they were voting before at the state level because of the Reconstruction Acts and the new constitutions. With their enthusiastic assistance, Grant carried every state of the former Confederacy, with the exception of Georgia and Louisiana, where Black men were kept from the polls by violence and intimidation. The win was not an easy one. Violent attacks on Black and white Republicans stymied the exercise of the elective franchise for many. Newspapers reported armed clashes between Black and white men throughout the South, leading up to the election and on election day. Reporting on the situation in Virginia in the weeks before the election, a Freedmen's Bureau agent argued that the fundamental doctrine of the conservative whites has been that Negro suffrage is an insult to their race and an outrage upon their rights. This feeling is intense and causes the Negro to be regarded as a positive enemy. In many sections of the state, large numbers of Blacks are under warning that they will be turned out of employment and driven off their lands if they vote Republican. In the scenes of violence, the Negroes were always the victims and the whites always the assailants. The Opelousas massacre in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, is representative of the violence inflicted upon African Americans and their white Republican allies in the weeks before the 1868 election. Tensions between the Democrats and Republicans had intensified after the April 1868 state constitution went into effect, giving African Americans in the state political rights. Fear of Black republicanism and a Republican-leaning editor's attack on the local Democrats led to an assault on Black and white Republicans on September 28th. Republicans estimated the Black deaths at more than 200. Even the Democrats admitted that the number reached several dozen. The impact of the violence on the Republican Party in St. Landry was devastating. In the 1870 census, the parish had a population of nearly 14,000 whites and more than 11,000 African Americans. In the 1868 election, 5,113 men had registered to vote. 2,102 of them were Republican. On election day, 4,616 votes were cast, every one of them for Seymour and Blair, and not a single one for Grant. Both Black and white Republicans dared not vote the Republican ticket for fear that they would be assaulted or lose their very lives. The Indiana Democrats supporting Vincent's Weekly Western Sun reported rather incredulously that in Savannah, Georgia, quote, the Negroes appeared in great numbers when the polls opened this morning and took entire possession of polling places. Every white man who came to vote was clubbed away. A pitched battle commenced between the two groups, and the Black men were driven back. When the police arrived to preserve order, a Black man purportedly drew a pistol and fatally shot one of them. In the end, 5 Black voters lost their lives and several received wounds. 4 policemen were wounded, in addition to the one who was supposedly killed. If this really happened with Black men being the aggressors, it would have been unusual indeed, because the reports that I have read indicate that it was just the other way around. The Black men were not the aggressors because they understood that they would be killed if they struck a first blow. While Grant had been slow in coming to the realization that Black men deserved to be given the elective franchise sooner rather than later, in his first inaugural address, he explicitly championed universal voting rights for Black men. The question of suffrage is one which is likely to agitate the public so long as a portion of the citizens of the nation are excluded from its privileges in any state, he argued. It seems to me very desirable that this question should be settled now. And I entertain the hope and express the desire that it may be the ratification of the 15th article of amendment to the Constitution. When the amendment was ratified in February 1870, Grant referred to it as a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. He did express his concern, however, that the Black men vote with intelligence and patriotism, and that they recognize the importance of being worthy of their new privilege. Lastly, he urged white Americans to refrain from interference in education that would help prepare the freedmen for citizenship. Violence against Republicans, especially against African Americans, continued unabated after Grant's election, as Southern Democrats sought to regain control of the electoral process. Domestic terrorists such as the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia slaughtered Black men, women, and children in their homes, burned Black churches and schoolhouses, and visited special vengeance upon anyone who voted for, supported, or served as a Republican official. The continued violence led Congress to launch an investigation whose report prompted passage of 3 enforcement acts against Klan terrorism. When these measures did not stop the violence, Grant sent troops to the affected regions. Without the imposition of martial law, however, the results were not altogether satisfactory. In a wide-ranging annual message to Congress in December of 1870, Grant alluded to the continuing violence that affected certain areas of the old Confederacy, trying to present a positive view of the Southern condition. He assured Congress that comparative harmony had been achieved. But he could not sidestep the violence that continued to convulse African American communities. Admitting this, he suggested that a free exercise of the elective franchise has by violence and intimidation been denied to citizens in exceptional cases in several of the states lately in rebellion. And the verdict of the people has thereby been reversed. He expressed his desire to secure the ballot and permit every man who is entitled to cast it to do so without fearing retaliation because of the color of his skin, birth, or political affiliation. Continued violence prompted a Republican-led Congress to launch an investigation which resulted, as I indicated, in the Enforcement Acts of 1870, but I haven't quite indicated what those acts actually did. The first one actually made it a federal crime to deny anyone access to the polls because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The second law extended the violations that were covered by the first act and assigned punishment for those crimes. The final law authorized the president to use federal troops to enforce the law and to suspend habeas corpus when necessary. While some scholars have argued that these acts temporarily destroyed the Klan, others point to the fact that the charges brought under federal law were secondary, that the more serious ones, such as murder, were in the purview of the states and punishment was minimal. Perhaps so, but the laws themselves at least suggested to the Klan and other groups that they could not continue their practices with impunity. On the eve of the election of 1872, Grant had amassed a significant record of championing the rights of African Americans, especially in voting and protection from political violence. Yet re-election with the assistance of the Black vote was not assured. As much as African Americans may have appreciated Grant's support of voting rights, there were those who were deeply concerned about the future of the Republican Party, as well as its continued commitment to the free people. One such individual was William G. Brown, the editor of the African American paper, The Louisianan. Months before the 72 election, Brown expressed his concern that the party of human rights and human liberty was being turned into one which every pirate bearing down upon the national treasury now flies the flag of republicanism. These misdeeds make the best and bravest party a hack for office holders and plunderers. Brown also lamented that freedom of speech, of the press, and political action was not yet secured in the South. So long as lawlessness remained in the form of terrorist groups, the party was destined for failure. While he urged all Republicans to stand behind the current administration, Brown warned that the president and his advisors could not afford to divide the party by adopting schemes such as the annexation of Santo Domingo. The administration's decision to annex the Caribbean nation had caused great division among Republican leaders, as some questioned the president's motivation and the merit of making a Black independent country subordinate to the United States. Others objected to the merger because Grant had envisioned making the country a state and granting its residents the same rights of citizenship as other Americans. Grant stated his motivation for proposing annexation in a special message to Congress in May 1870, and again in December, that year, on the occasion of his second annual address to Congress, in language that revealed the nation's strongly imperialistic interest. He referenced its geographical location and its natural resources, and suggested that annexation would ensure that no other foreign nation got possession of it. He argued that acquiring San Domingo was in keeping with the Monroe Doctrine. It is to build up our merchant marine. It is to furnish new markets for the products of our farms, shops, and manufacturers. It is to make slavery insupportable in Cuba and Puerto Rico at once and ultimately so in Brazil. So what he's saying is that if the United States has possession of Santo Domingo, where people are free, it's going to be very difficult for these other nations to continue with slavery, because enslaved people are going to run to this free area that is supported by the United States. It is to furnish our citizens with the necessities of everyday life at cheaper rates than ever before. Grant argued that the government of Santo Domingo had requested the annexation and that the people were not capable of maintaining themselves in their present condition. They yearned for the protection of our free institutions and laws. our progress and civilization. The Santo Domingo annexation plan received a mixed response from Americans, Black and white. While both Hiram Revels, Black U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and Joseph Rainey, Congressman from South Carolina, Black Congressman from South Carolina, supported annexation, other Black leaders objected to the plan because of the potential to exploit the country without benefit to its residents. Frederick Douglass supported Grant's plans, despite the objections of his longtime friend, Senator Charles Sumner, who argued that talks of annexation were driven by business interest. In complaining his contrary position on the matter, Douglass would later write that, to Mr. Sumner, annexation was a measure of extinguishing a colored nation, and to do so by means of selfish motives. To me, it meant the alliance of a weak and defenseless people having none of the attributes of a nation, torn by internal feuds and unable to maintain order at home or command respect abroad, to a government which would give it peace, stability, and civilization. And historians, even today, historians sort of criticize Douglass for having taken that position. Sumner's attack on Grant and his suggestion that African Americans should support the liberal Republican Party candidate, Horace Greeley, and the liberal Republican Party had been formed in opposition to Grant's Southern policy. But so they had actually put Horace Greeley up as their candidate, and Democrats eventually went along with that and supported Greeley as well. But this matter, this change, compelled Douglass to increase his solicitation of Black voters on behalf of the president. In an address titled "To the Colored People of the United States," he outlined why they should continue to support the Republican Party and its candidate. Douglass argued that from the time he took command of federal forces and through his first term in office, Grant had protected the interest of African Americans. He had carried out Lincoln's promise of emancipation and had been the first liberator of the enslaved. He anticipated the Freedmen's Bureau by ensuring that the contraband were supplied with food, clothing, and medical care, provided education and employment. He had appointed Black men to office and had protected the community from terrorism. Whether Douglass's argument calmed the fears of Black men, or as loyal Republicans, they saw no reason to change presidential candidates, they overwhelmingly supported Grant in the 1872 election. The only states of the former Confederacy he lost were Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee. The 1872 Republican Party platform had reaffirmed its commitment to enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments. And in his second inaugural address, President Grant suggested that he would continue to fight for the civil rights that accompanied citizenship. In regard to social equality, he argued that African Americans be given a fair chance to improve themselves, to educate their children, and to travel about the nation unmolested. But he was not suggesting that there should be full social equality. In both 1868 and 1872, African Americans turned out to support politically a man they believed to have advanced their quest for full citizenship. Grant had led the Army of Liberation that secured their freedom after Lincoln had issued the proclamation. He had encouraged fair treatment of the newly emancipated and had pressed the cause of enfranchisement. Once they were allowed to vote, they had helped to place him in the White House. Yet they understood that no single individual is fully responsible for either the successes or failures of an era or a moment in time, and that others made significant contributions to Black advancement as well. In response to the suggestion that 2 scholarships be created at Wilberforce University that would honor both Lincoln and Grant, Reverend Elisha Weaver of the Christian Recorder, he was the editor of the Christian Recorder, did not object to the idea, but reminded his readers of the heroes among them who were never recognized. Have we not had men of our race who traveled on errands of love, of truth, of justice, he argued? Men who have lived for humanity, have taken up arms and sacrificed their lives for their country, if we do not recognize their worth in memorials, who will? The nation, the state, the city has never reared a monument or established a memorial as a memento of the philanthropy, heroism, or sacrifice of a Negro, nor do we expect it of them. Do you desire to fund a scholarship at your college as a memorial to some great and wise hero who answered duty's call and sacrificed his life for his fellow men? Then let it be some Black hero. Let the memento be to our Black boys in blue who answered the call to arms. Undoubtedly, the commander of Union forces, and as one who acknowledged the importance of Black men in winning the war for the Union, Grant would have approved of that sentiment. Thank you so much for listening.